Hey everybody, welcome back to Justice for South Dakota. This is episode 4, where we're going to delve into the deep question, who is Timothy John Evans? Now, these series of pictures have Tim replacing the door to Rachel's bedroom in Rachel's house in Rapid City in the countryside, that Tim came to her house and entered it, and she sought refuge inside her bedroom. She had it blocked with a crutch, and Tim kicked it in December 2017. And all of this was covered in the transcripts, which we'll see later. So again, we're referring to Court File 51 out of Pennington County. Case file number is DIV 18-41. And we're going to be answering the questions, who is Timothy John Evans? Why was Judge Connolly so eager to preside over this case? What's ultimately at stake? When did the evidence of Timothy's mistress or mistresses come out? And how did the Supreme Court respond to all this corruption? Delving into Tim's early childhood, he was born to a single 16-year-old mother in Helena, Montana. The mother gave him up for adoption, so Tim's case is currently closed. His birth mother has never attempted to contact him, and Tim has no legal rights to try to contact her because the case is sealed. At 3 weeks old, Timothy was adopted by Walter and Judy Evans. They were in their 50s. They had already been married for a while, tried to have kids, and were unsuccessful. Tim has one older adopted sister, and his father, Walter, passed away in 2006. Now, Tim has verified night terrors since he was a child. When he was 15 years old, he snuck his girlfriend down into his bedroom to have sex and woke up in the middle of a night terror. His mother came downstairs to find not only a girl in his room, but also Tim banging on the walls. And of course, the girl was extremely trying to figure out what was going on with Tim and scared that she got caught. Then Tim joined the Navy at 18 years old. He was stationed on a submarine, and he was discharged after serving 4 years and 7 months due to his continuing night terrors. Tim seems to experience these night terrors anytime he's under stress or in enclosed spaces. And I can say this because I was married to him for 17 years. Now, some other key players in this episode are Jeff and Susanne Haskell, some of the mistresses. Now, Jeff and Susanne were Tim's lifelong friends. They met in 6th grade in Great Falls, Montana. Jeff and Sue wound up being high school sweethearts, allegedly, and they got married when Jeff was 19. Susanne, Jeff, and Tim frequently hung out together from 6th grade and then later in high school until Tim joined the Navy. Now, spoiler alert, which one was Tim's mistress from 2015 onward, or were they both? We're going to answer this directly from the divorce transcripts. Now, remember that Tim got kicked out of the Navy due to his night terrors, so he returned home to Havre, which is in Hill County, Montana, and he married Stacy Goulet on July 25th, 1992. A child was born in 1995. She's a very sweet young girl, currently in her 20s, wants absolutely nothing to do with her dad. Tim divorced Stacy, alleging Stacy was a drug addict, and also Stacy was guilty of infidelity. The formal decree of dissolution was entered on May 27th, 2005. Now, it is interesting that even though Tim alleges Stacy was a drug addict and all these other issues, Tim did not get custody of his daughter. Tim had to pay Stacy both spousal support and child support. And remember, I reference everything directly to what has gone on in the court cases, so I'm proving to you how Judge Connolly and Kristi Noem's judges are all perverted and corrupt, and you can find this in Trial Exhibit 34. Now, broke and penniless, Tim Evans borrowed $5,700 because he didn't have a house. So, at 10% interest rate on June 8, 2004, he purchased a 1986 single-wide modular home. The total price he paid for this home was $11,579, which included the closing fees. However, he did not have property. It was sitting where he had to pay lot rent every month. Imagine buying a house for that cheap. Now, by March 2005, Tim had over $37,000 in assets, which included all his business equipment, which we will talk about in episode 5. However, he was in debt over $41,000 because he needed a vehicle, and he was not very wise with his money. All of this was summarized in Trial Exhibit 44. Tim's only professional certifications were EMT Basic. Now, who is Rachel? Well, in summary, Rachel grew up on a farm to very conservative parents with 10 children. Rachel thought naively that all men were like her father. She never saw her father lift his hand against anybody. He never cussed, never drank, never smoked. Very strong Christian family, and he occasionally did raise his voice at his children when they got the large equipment in to trouble out in the fields. For instance, driving a semi-truck out in the field because the farm was over 1,200 acres, and it was pulling two 20-foot trailers, and a sister buried it up to the axles in the middle of a hayfield in mud when the trailer was fully loaded with tons of hay. So in instances like that, her father raised his voice, but otherwise she had never seen a man act out in aggression towards a woman. At 18 years old, Rachel moved into Great Falls, Montana, and immediately obtained her certified nursing assistant degree, and then she worked full-time with lots of overtime at Benefice Healthcare. Meanwhile, she put herself through night classes in Choteau, Montana, which was 50 minutes away. She obtained her National Registry Emergency Medical Technician Basic Certificate and began volunteering with Emergency Medical Services. Then she also obtained her National Registry Emergency Medical Technician Intermediate degree through the College of Technology in Great Falls and continued to work at Benefice 60 hours a week. 19 years old, Rachel decided to move up to Alaska. So she did, where she promptly always had at least 3 jobs going on. Her full-time job, where she dealt with babies in the NICU of all 3 hospitals, and then she was a very active volunteer for Alaska Emergency Medical Services and also had jobs on the weekends because her entire goal was saving up money to pay cash for college. When Rachel met Tim, we'll compare salaries later, but she already made more money than he did at 22 years old. And she was in her second year of nursing degree, paid over $11,000 cash for education, and had 0 debt. Rachel's assets were over $22,000. Now, Rachel was taking 19 credits a semester. Her GPA was 3.9, worked full-time as a waitress in addition to going to school full-time. She was on track to graduate with her Bachelor's of Science in Nursing 1 semester after her Associates of Science in Nursing degree, simply because 12 credits of the clinical classes required to complete the Bachelor's, you had to have an Associate's prior to enrolling. So why exactly did Tim prey on Rachel? Well, Rachel quit waitressing when she met Tim and decided to go to work for him. Tim had a carpet cleaning company. In addition, Tim was a full-time city fireman, so he had employees, which were college students, run his carpet cleaning company for him. So Rachel began working for Tim in October 2004. However, because it was very physical labor, she herniated a disc in her back in March of 2005. Because Rachel had a herniated disc, Tim put her inside his house where she was doing bookwork and stuff for him, and he raped her in April of 2005. Little did Rachel know, Tim was still married to Stacy Goulet Evans. Tim threatened Rachel with silence, saying that he would lose custody of his child and possibly go to jail for rape. It was all Rachel's fault if that happened. I mean, after all, he raped her because he loved her, right? She's so beautiful, he couldn't help himself. So Rachel agreed not to press charges. Then Rachel found out she was pregnant. Rachel refused to have an abortion. Tim threatened Rachel that if she told anyone what happened, he would take away her unborn baby and she would never see her son again. Tim then used his position as a former police officer to threaten Rachel, stating that he would win in any courtroom setting. Now, in episode 5, we're going to go into detail through Tim's his professional career and all of the lies and deception that's affiliated with his professional all of his jobs, but he was a Haber police officer for, I believe, 7 years. It's detailed out in episode 5, prior to becoming a full-time city fireman. So he was a police officer for most of the time that he was married to Stacy. Now, Montana Senate Bill 22 was not enacted until 2017. And that is when Montana passed a law where a father does not have parental rights if the child was conceived by rape. This was only 11 years too late for Rachel, who was then forced to marry her rapist so she could protect her unborn child and see her son. Rachel decided to make the most of it, and ultimately, when Rachel married Tim, she decided that even though she couldn't look at him without wanting to vomit, she had to get through this and make Tim the happiest man in the world. So Rachel married Tim in July of 2005, just short weeks after his divorce with Stacy, and Rachel's oldest son was born in January of 2006. Rachel spent over 12 years making Tim the happiest man in the world so she could avoid abuse and be with her children. And again, this is very detailed in the court documents. Now, Rachel exclusively raised her children while she obtained graduate degrees. Not only did she get a registered nursing degree, but then she went back to school in 2010 through 2013, and she got a nurse midwife degree. Those are Rachel's 2 youngest children. When she graduated, her baby was not even a year old. So Rachel has 4 children. She raised them as a single mother, their only caregiver for 12 years. There are so many pictures of Rachel's children with family that I have chosen not to put in pictures of cousins if possible, but when we do have pictures of cousins, then I'm going to glitter their faces out. So Rachel cares deeply about grandparents. Rachel had her 2 sets of grandparents. Tim had no family except his mom and sister. So Rachel brought the kids to Texas and also to Montana frequently so that they could see their great-grandparents. Now, Rachel's one great-grandma did live in a nursing home because she has Alzheimer's, and when she passed away, Tim refused to let Rachel's kids even go down to have a memorial service. Now, this is Grandma Judy. Grandma Judy is the amazing woman who adopted Tim. Grandma Judy was older than any of Rachel's grandparents, which was quite interesting. Have a mother-in-law that's older than any of my grandparents. She was an awesome lady. And she loved my children. She loved me. She happened to also live in a nursing home in Billings. So anytime I drove through Billings, I would stop in with my kids and visit Grandma Judy. And Grandma Judy also came up to live with us quite a few times for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. And I took care of her. I was also very deeply involved in church from being a child all the way up until now. And so I raised my children in church. Tim agreed to come along, and he also got involved just to the extent that I learned he could prey on other women. So not knowing it, me being blissfully ignorant, we started volunteering extensively with Fountain Springs Church in Rapid City, and here's just one of our Christmas photos. Now, I also had my kids involved in the community events and extensive volunteering with them. I was my children's soccer coach for 4 years. I brought my 2 years up in Havre, 2 years down in Rapid City. I brought my children to lots of games. They had swim lessons, all sorts of stuff. I had fun with my kids. We were always doing something. I did work, but I also spent a ton of time with my children. I intentionally had jobs where I would be able to work less than 40 hours a week. So whether that was if I was on call and it would be like a 24-hour period and then I would have the next day off, something like that. I'd take the boys to monster trucks and my daughter on spa dates. I was the leader for my daughter's youth groups. I took my boys and my nephew on a mud run. We're very active together, and I have hundreds and hundreds of pictures. These are just surrounding the time of the court case, and this is what Judge Connolly used to base his decisions on. I took them climbing and rappelling and visited caves, all the way down to Disney World and then Universal Studios. I took my children skiing, made sure that they went at least once a month, and then we went back to Montana. All of this was without Tim present, and spent extensive time with the cousins and made sure that my children had a very deep relationship with their family. Now, it should be noted that while I was in nurse midwifery school and I was 100% with my children without Tim even being there, I was actually in Idaho doing a residency, and my brother and his kids came to visit. My kids and my brother's kids are best friends. We went to Yellowstone, to Galveston, and then NASA, and then Houston, and San Antonio. Thankfully, my children are amazing troopers, and they traveled quite well, because there's no way that I could do this as a single parent, except my kids are amazing. Then we went to the Pacific Coast for a wedding of one of my brothers. Remember, I have 9 siblings. Meanwhile, what was Tim doing while I was spending all this time with my kids? Now, you probably guessed it. There are, indeed, I was surprised to learn, 6 different types of affairs. Category 4, according to Rick Reynolds, is wanting the marriage and the affair, which is exactly what I was involved in. Tim, the man of empty relationships and one-night stands. Now, he wrote one of my sisters a letter saying that he only feels like a man when he, quote, conquers a woman. Tim further expanded in writing that he's trying to explain why he's divorcing me, and he told my sister that this gives Rachel 13 years to get over herself and decide to do marriage God's way. Tim claimed God's way was me being submissive and going along with his relationships and actively sleeping with other women. What brought on this divorce? It's when Rachel stood up to Tim and said, no, a marriage is between one man and one woman. And he needed to choose. Either he could have his affairs or his relationship with Rachel, but she would no longer allow him to do both. So Timothy testified under oath to Judge Connolly that he had well over 30 one-night stands before he married Rachel. Remember, every single fact I say is grounded in testimony under oath, penalty of perjury, in the transcripts. Timothy testified to Judge Connolly about his one-night stands. He told me during our marriage that he had had over 46 sexual relationships prior to marrying me. And now during his marriage to Rachel, this number kept climbing up. So then all of a sudden, Tim sends Rachel this text message that says, "Excuse my ignorance, but can we start having sex with other people while we're married, or do we have to get divorced first?" This was when Rachel had found out about Tim's affair with Susanne Haskell, and Tim had tried to force Rachel into swinging or having sex with his best friend Jeff, which we'll go into later. Rachel refused. That's why Rachel was not submissive. And Tim was going to give me 13 years to come back. He was going to give me 13 years to decide that I would be okay with an open marriage with his two best friends, Susanne and Jeff. Now, it gets better than this. Anyways, Rachel, of course, refused. So what happened? Tim started hitting her. He started abusing her. He started all of this horrible cycle. Now, I chose in October 2020 to speak out in honor of domestic violence because I work with women who are abused all the time as a medical provider. And because I spoke out about it, Judge Connolly, Judge Lindgren, and Judge Guzinski in Pennington County all immediately decided I was not a fit parent. I should not have anything to do with my children. However, they decided that, and this will also be discussed in a future episode, because then they found out that everything I said was true. But it goes better. So, this is a cycle of violence, and first the abuser apologizes for what happened, and then they make excuses. Well, I only did it because I loved you. I only did it because you're so beautiful. And then there's this stage where they don't hit, they don't do the abuse, and then they come back and they do, and typically they prey on naive, trusting people. So that way they have somebody who's continually the victim of their abuse because they know that they can control and they won't leave. During the court trial, Tim testified many, many, many times about how he abused Rachel to Judge Connolly. He testified how he held me by my arms, grabbed me, and held me up against a wall. He forgot to put in the choking part, where he tried to choke me multiple times. Tim did admit that one time he held me up in front of one of my sons, and also a neighbor boy walked in, and then he looked at them and said, "But mommy and daddy are just playing." Well, I'm sorry, but I don't know couples that play like that. Tim kicked in that bedroom door to gain entrance when I sought protection against him. Tim sprayed me and my 4-year-old son while we were sleeping with pepper spray. Then he claimed that he had a nightmare. Tim admitted he had a handgun in the bedroom. He used to sleep with it underneath his pillow, and I was afraid he's going to kill me while he is, after the pepper spray incident. So in court, Tim denied that it was underneath his pillow. Tim did, however, admit on, I believe it was December 8th, that he pulled me out of my bed. When I was sleeping, he attacked me, pulled me out of my bed, and allegedly he was defending himself. But remember, I was sleeping. It was 2-something in the morning. All this will be covered in a later episode that Judge Connolly is fully aware of. And he actually fractured my pelvis on my right side. I, at the advice of a police officer, then sought a protection order. Judge Connolly denied the protection order, which we'll again cover at a later episode, but that's why these transcript references are a TPO. The TR stands for a transcript, TPO stands for the temporary protection order hearing transcript, and Judge Connolly found that he could not find any domestic violence had occurred despite all this extensive testimony of Tim doing it. Now, I did have to go under extensive rehab and diagnostic imaging verifying that I had this injury from Tim, and ultimately it got to the point where I couldn't even walk anymore. So in August 11th of 2022, I had to undergo surgery and have a hip debridement and repair to go in and clean out my fractured pelvis on my right hip and shave off part of my femur and everything else, completely non-weight bearing for a month, and the justices don't care. Besides the physical abuse, I suffered extensive verbal abuse at the hands of Tim. And this is just in a year's time, when he knew that he was getting a divorce, that I have evidence in writing, which are introduced into evidence in the court. That's all that I'm using, of the words that he called me and screamed at me. I now wish that, remember, I didn't know a man could do any of this because I only had the example of my father, an extremely stable Christian man. And I had no idea that a man would be capable of abusing like Tim abused me. So I wish that I had been able to now know what I know, and I would have recorded him on my phone, and I would have gotten the hell out of there so much faster. But when you're actually involved in an abusive situation, your only mentality is to survive. And so looking back, I would have done things so much differently. Now, Judge Connolly did not find Timothy guilty of anything, but he did find that I caused Tim mental anguish because I called Tim a philanderer, which is a man who frequently enters into casual sexual relationships with a woman or a womanizer. And now please refer back to earlier in this episode. By Tim's own admission, he had over 30 one-night stands that he told Judge Connolly about. And because I called him a philanderer and refused to sleep with him any longer when he has an open marriage, I subjected Tim to mental anguish. Now, Timothy insisted that both parties undergo psychiatric evaluations because obviously Rachel is psychotic, and that's why Tim has to act the way he acts, and that's why he has to treat her the way he treats her. So Tim went to his psychologist first, and Dr. Scott Sternhagen. Remember, I'm not going to put down ICD-10 codes here for Tim, even though they are part of the court transcripts and the record. But out of privacy for Tim, I'm only going to mention comments that they made. But I have extensive documentation of Tim's mental health ICD-10 codes and issues that are all over the court. Anyways, Dr. Scott marked Tim with marked distress that is out of proportion to the stressor, stating Timothy exhibited irritable behavior and angry outbursts. Then Tim saw Dr. Carrie Scoville, another psychologist, who diagnosed Timothy as being resistant to authority, gregarious, and enjoys attention, seeks attention from others in order to gain social recognition. Now, Dr. Carrie Scoville gave all this, her impression of Tim, knowing that Tim was involved in a divorce case with me. She actually was subpoenaed by Tim to come into court and testify on his behalf. And during that time, she testified to Judge Connolly that she was afraid Timothy would stop at absolutely nothing to harm his future ex-wife, referring to Rachel. And it should be noted that in April 2019, Timothy was hospitalized for the second time with an acute mental health crisis, being inpatient overnight. Judge Connolly refuses to acknowledge Tim has any mental health concerns. Now, Tim also has a drinking problem. Another officer at Pennington County came in to court and testified that Rachel requested him to do a welfare check of her children in July 2017. Now, because Rachel works in remote critical access places and she's also a medical provider, I had to go to San Diego for a 2-day conference on cervical cancer and skills for colposcopies and that sort of thing, so that I could treat women for cervical cancer. And Tim took my children during that time, subjected them to these unknown people inside the house, and he was heavily drinking. I was afraid of sex trafficking because Tim ran in the circles where he was around the people. with extramarital affairs, and I had fear for the safety of my children, called a police officer who then came into court to testify about that situation. And he said that as a parent and law enforcement officer, he felt that I had grounds for concern with Tim's behavior that night and how Tim was raising his children, and there's future testimony about Tim's drinking problem later. So what happened? Well, Tim knew that he had zero chance in hell to get my children away from him, but that's what he was going to do, because he told me if he could take my kids away from me, that I would stay married to him even after we're divorced, because there was no way I would be without my children. So Tim started to call law enforcement after he filed for divorce, claiming Rachel has anger issues and is known to beat on the kids. Now remember, I have hundreds of pictures. I'm volunteering with my kids. My kids are in swim lessons twice a week without clothes on, except for swimming trunks, and they're all changing in communal dressing rooms at the YMCA in Rapid City. So if I'm threatening my children life-threatening abuse, don't you think that somebody else would see it besides me? Because how am I going to cover up these bruises? Judge Connolly refused to accept that, though. So he decided that he would take my kids away from me, just because Tim is a guy. So I have a list of call logs there where every single time Tim called the cops, it was found to be false. And finally, May 4th, 2018, Tim called the law enforcement officer, alleging I abused him. They responded to the house, spoke with me. Notice we weren't even living together at this point, because Tim kicked me out in March 2018 of my own house. Anyways, the law enforcement officer requested a warrant for Tim's arrest for abusing me, not the other way around. So because Dr. Carrie Scoville, Tim's psychologist, reported in paper that Timothy had made allegations of me abusing my children on March 9th, including, to quote Tim, "In the past week she grabbed my oldest son by the neck and left a big red mark. And on average, Rachel has been spanking her sons 4 to 5 times per week and her daughter 2 to 3 times per week." So March the 23rd, 2018, I'd requested a protection order from Tim for beating me up and fracturing my pelvis. Judge Connolly denied that protection order, saying he couldn't find any domestic violence had happened. Then he promptly granted Tim interim primary custody of my 4 children based on these unfounded allegations without any evidence. He didn't have a single picture. He had zero testimony, nothing, just the allegation. And then we underwent a formal child abuse investigation. Judge Connolly also decided that since Timothy was a resident of Montana and I had a house in Pennington County where my children lived with me, that he would give Tim my house so that way my children were not displaced. So he evicted me. I'm now homeless. Now let's back up a minute. Remember Sue? Well, Tim's girlfriend, or his affair, because remember, she's married to Jeff. She had told Tim that she wanted my house. And so Tim was trying to figure out how to get me evicted from my house, because then he could move his girlfriend Sue in there. So I'm now homeless. I moved to Montana, May 2018. That's the last law enforcement record I put for you. There's a total of over 60 of them in Pennington County. These allegations, all of Tim's allegations, were investigated by Case and Brown and found to be false. Also, even the children denied that I had abused them, and when Timothy insisted that I had left bruises on my oldest son immediately told him no, and this was recorded, and my son did not know that Tim was recording him. Tim was recording my children trying to bribe them and get them to say I abused them. And my oldest son immediately said, "No, Dad, that did not come from Mom. That came from blank, the neighbor boy," as they were wrestling. So Case and Brown did his investigation. He was a licensed clinical social worker. He performed an extremely extensive investigation from May through September, I believe, of 2018, and he came into court and testified. He found that Tim relayed false statements to him regarding the abuse during the evaluation. He specifically found that Rachel did not abuse her children. Tim claimed that the children didn't have bruises on them because Rachel slathered them with arnica gel to prevent any bruising from occurring after she, beat the crap out of them. And Kaysen found that that was not true. He found that Timothy spanked the children. By their own admission, they said, "No, Mom doesn't hurt us, but Dad does." And he also found that Tim was the only one who raised a hand against my 4 children during the time of his investigation. So even when Tim was under investigation for child abuse, he could not refrain himself from hitting my children when I was not there to protect my children from him. Kaysen found that it was an exaggeration for my second son to claim that he was spanked, quote, 30 times at once, and that there was absolutely no evidence of neglect, abandonment, or leaving my children alone for hours on end while I went on different things. And we'll get into every single accusation and allegation and how Judge Connolly specifically heard evidence 100% from all these other professionals, and then how the Supreme Court ruled on what they ruled, 100% contrary to the evidence in court. Kaysen further said that there was no concerns with Rachel's parenting or the quality of her children's education. In fact, they had tested far above their peers during the time that Rachel was raising her children. Now, Judge Connolly is fully aware that there are state laws against false reporting of child abuse, and if you refer back to that other slide for law enforcement, Tim said not only to Kaysen Brown, "I abused my kids," but also to law enforcement close to 60 times, and every single time it was found to be false. So the Child Welfare Information Gateway has issued a pamphlet because it's illegal to report falsely child abuse in almost every single state in the United States and territories. And the majority of the states have criminal charges associated with false reporting intentionally. South Dakota also has a law against that the judge is supposed to take into consideration in a custody dispute false reporting of abuse. Now, on May 15th, 2018, Rachel underwent her psychiatric evaluation that Timothy had requested because Judge Connolly ordered it in March, and then Tim picked who Rachel was going to go talk to. And she saw Dr. Hughes. Dr. Hughes reported back to Judge Connolly that Rachel had 0 depression, anxiety, psychosis, or a formal thought disorder. However, she voiced concern that Rachel's responses, after all of this extensive testing and questioning for over 6 hours, that Rachel, over multiple days, that Rachel's responses indicated she might continue to make unreasonable and unhealthy concessions to remain in an unsafe relationship with her husband. Now, Dr. Hughes said this despite the fact that this is now May 15th and 17th, I believe, that Tim had served divorce papers on Rachel January 23rd, that Rachel and Tim had not lived together for 2 years, and Rachel had the crap beat out of her by Tim. She had a pelvis fracture that was healing. She had everything in her was survival mode and to protect her children. So Rachel was not staying in a relationship with Tim. She was simply trying to protect her children. Rachel then saw Dr. Mark Odell through the summer and fall, and he counseled Rachel and then testified to Judge Connolly during the divorce trial that Rachel specifically does not have any of the 10 personality disorders listed in the DSM-5. And then Judge Connolly promptly found that Rachel had a mental health disorder, even though it's not found in the evidence at all. However, he could not find Tim had a mental health disorder, so I'm thinking maybe Judge Connolly is dyslexic. He's getting stuff backwards. Anyways, Rachel was then enrolled in the Victims of Crime Act program through Pennington County because law enforcement found Tim had abused Rachel. So Rachel then received counseling to process Tim's abuse in 2019 and beyond through the VOCA program, where Rachel received the following ICD-10 diagnoses. So it's now very apparent Tim's a narcissist and he likes to gaslight. He's accusing everybody else of doing what he's doing. But now the question is, who was Tim's next victim? And this is Holly Lou Bentley Creek Soper. Or is Holly preying on Rachel's children? Because after Tim broke up with Suze, then he hooked up with multiple other women that I'm leaving out for now. And then he had a 2-year, 1.5 year long relationship with Holly. So in the upcoming episodes, we're going to explore exactly who is Holly Lou Bentley Creek Soper. Why did Tim choose to hook up with her? Is she his next victim, or is it because she is equally skilled at abuse and trying to master manipulate? So yet again, Judge Connolly found Tim innocent of everything, and he rides again. He's currently looking for his next victim. In the upcoming episodes, we're going to look at what ultimately was at stake. Why was Judge Connolly so eager to preside over this case? When did the evidence of Timothy's other mistress come out in court? Spoiler alert, it's a guy. So does that mean that he's a Mr. S and not a mistress? And then where did Timothy get prosecuted on all his criminal charges? And how did the Supreme Court respond to all this corruption that's 100% found in the transcripts and evidence submitted at the court during the trial? How did they respond to that? Or is Justice Jensen just as guilty and he's a perverted judge? And the answer is affirmative to that last one. So again, because I am using story after story of how this happens every single day in court in Pennington County, I'm calling the people of South Dakota to hold Governor Noem accountable to her oath when she took office. We covered this extensively in episode 1. South Dakota Constitution, Article 4, Section 3. Kristi Noem, you are, by your own admission, supposed to enforce compliance by your legislative department, but they have enacted laws. I'm now calling on you to have the judges uphold them. Or, because you are currently aware of all this, you deserve to be impeached. And in the upcoming episodes, we're going to continue investigating all of these that I had listed. And stay tuned, because next we'll turn to perverted law enforcement, the state's attorney's office who's in on this, and remember we covered Mark Vargo at the very beginning, and every level of judge from the circuit to the Supreme Court. Again, Justice for Families is self-funded. This is a public exposure of the corruption, and donations are welcome. Thank you, and stay tuned for episode 5.